Imagine the scream splits the room like an axe through green wood. You stand in a Salem Village house in 1692 AD, hands cold from counting winter stores, grain, salt, firewood, when the minister's child folds like a broken chair. You see her eyes roll white. You hear a choking sound that makes every adult in the room move at once. But nobody knows where to put their hands, because the enemy is not a wolf, not an arrow, not a blade. The enemy is invisible. Therefore, every stare in the room hunts the same thing, a name. You push forward with neighbors, boots scraping plank, elbows tight, breath sharp. You see another girl jerk and twist as if ropes pull her joints from the ceiling. You feel the air turn thick with prayer and panic. Somebody shouts a word that explains everything and demands action in the same breath, which? The word lands hard. It does not behave like a question. It behaves like a verdict. You see faces shift. The old farmer who survives raids and droughts looks relieved, because now the suffering has a shape. The mother who loses 2 children to fever nods as if the world finally makes sense. But the relief lasts a heartbeat, because the relief needs feeding. Therefore, the room needs a culprit the way a fire needs dry wood. A magistrate arrives like a blade sliding out of a sheath. You hear the thud of his boots. You see his hat come off, his eyes sweep the room, not searching for medicine or mercy, but for a target. He does not ask, what illness? He asks, who harms you? The question is a trap disguised as care. Outside, this village already carries bruises. Indian raids stalk the edges of the world. Harsh winters bite until bones ache. Debts sit on chests like stones. But a witch is simpler than hunger. Therefore, the room leans toward the simplest story, like a thirsty man leans toward a cup. You feel a hand clamp your shoulder. Fetch her. The order comes fast, like a slap. You do not ask who. The room already whispers the name. An outsider, a poor woman, someone easy to place beneath everyone else. You swallow, because obedience keeps suspicion away. But obedience also turns rumor into law. Therefore your legs move. You step outside. The cold stings. You run. Frozen ruts catch your boots and try to throw you. You hear your own breath saw in and out. You see neighbors running too, not because they love justice, but because nobody wants to be the one who stays behind and looks reluctant. Reluctance is a luxury Salem cannot afford. You reach a door. The house sits low, smoke thin from the chimney, poverty visible in every board. You raise your hand to knock. You feel the moment stretch, because once that knock lands, the accusation becomes real. Real accusations spread like fire through dry thatch. But your knuckles still strike wood. Therefore, the hunt begins. The door opens. A face appears, tired, wary, already familiar with hard stares. You see the instant she understands. She does not need the words. The crowd at your back carries the words on their tongues like iron. Someone reads the summons. Chains come out. You hear metal clink, a sound that means the law has teeth. She protests. The crowd tightens. But protests sound like guilt when everyone already believes. Therefore, the wrists go into irons. You march her through the village. Snow crunches. Dogs bark. Children appear in doorways, eyes wide, learning the shape of fear. You feel every window watching. You smell smoke and sweat and old wool. You hear the hiss of whispers. See? See how she looks. But the face of a prisoner always looks wrong, because terror makes every expression strange. Therefore, wrong becomes proof. The first hearing feels like a market, but the goods are human beings. You stand in a room packed tight. You see the magistrates at a table, quills ready, eyes fixed. You feel the press of bodies behind you like a tide that can crush. The afflicted girls enter and the room changes instantly. You hear their cries. You see fingers point as if arrows fly. She hurts us. She sits on us at night. Her spirit pinches. Obstacle 1 hits like a fist. The evidence is invisible. Spectral attacks. Dreams. Fits. A child points and the room obeys. You cannot measure it, cannot weigh it, cannot hold it up to the light. But it is treated like smoke from a gun seen, therefore real. But smoke can come from many fires. Therefore the room chooses the fire it already fears. You watch the accused speak. Her voice shakes. She denies. The denial does not calm the room, it angers it. The magistrate leans forward. Why do they cry out at you? It sounds fair, but it is not. It is a question that assumes the answer. The girls convulse at her words as if her syllables are knives. The room gasps. Someone mutters scripture. But scripture does not explain why pain picks one neighbor and not another. Therefore, the town chooses a human reason. You become a runner in a town that learns a new sport, suspicion. You carry summons papers from house to house. Each paper feels heavier than the last, like ink turns into lead. You see neighbors testify against neighbors with faces that say, "Speak first or die last." You hear the brittle politeness in voices that hide terror. But terror always leaks out. Therefore, you see it in trembling hands, in eyes that cannot meet yours. The jail becomes a machine. You step inside and the air turns sour. Chains clink like insects. You smell sweat trapped in straw, damp wool, old urine. You hear coughs that never stop. The cells fill. New bodies arrive daily, and the old bodies do not leave. But the jail does not run on pity. Therefore, every day inside costs money. You watch families sell goods to pay fees for their own imprisonment. A woman hands over a pot, a quilt, a cow, anything to keep her husband from starving in a cell. The jailer counts coins with calm fingers. You feel sick because survival now requires payment to the same system that accuses. But nobody dares call it theft. Therefore, it becomes order. Outside the hearings, whispers swarm like flies. You hear old boundary lines spoken as if they are scripture, whose fence sits inches too far, whose pasture steals water. You hear unpaid loans, inheritance fights, bitter church quarrels, who sits closer to power, who speaks louder in meeting, who receives respect. But these grudges cannot be shouted openly without shame. Therefore, they slip into the cracks of witchcraft. A name rises, and you feel your stomach drop because it is not the poor outsider now. It is someone with land. It is someone with a sharp tongue. It is someone who refuses to bow. But accusing the powerful takes courage. Therefore, the accusers find courage when the crowd rewards it. You stand again in a hearing. The afflicted scream. The accused tries to speak, but the scream drowns her. You see the magistrate's eyes narrow, not with cruelty, but with certainty. Certainty is the most dangerous weapon in the room. But certainty demands consistency. Therefore, the court begins to build rules that make doubt look like betrayal. The trials accelerate. You carry more summons. You see more doors open to fear. A mother clutches her child. A husband reaches for a Bible as if it is a shield. You feel your own palms sweat when a neighbor's eyes linger too long on your face. But nobody says, "Stop." Therefore, the line keeps moving. You hear a new phrase spoken with bureaucratic calm, oyer and terminer. Hear and determine. Two words that feel like a trap snapping shut. The new court forms like a storm front. The magistrates sit straighter. The room sits quieter for a moment, not because the fear lessens, but because the fear now wears robes. The decisive minute arrives without warning. You stand inside the court as a new accusation detonates. The afflicted cry out in unison as if commanded by a drummer. Their fingers stab the air like daggers. Everyone turns toward you, toward every face, to see who flinches. Because flinching looks like guilt. Stillness looks like guilt too. You feel your throat go dry. You try to swallow, but your mouth holds dust. The accused stands there, hands bound, cheeks hollow from jail. She refuses to confess. The court wants compliance, not truth. But compliance is the only thing that stops the screaming. Therefore, confession becomes a kind of medicine. A condemned neighbor stands and denies again. The denial is calm, almost stubborn. You hear the rope in your mind before anyone brings it out. The judges ask again. The afflicted convulse again. The room surges with the same hunger. Say the words. Confess. Name others. But the neighbor's eyes stay steady. Therefore, the court's patience hardens. You feel the logic twist until it breaks. The innocent deny, so they die. The guilty confess, so they live, sometimes. The system rewards the story the court needs. But the court calls it mercy. Therefore, mercy becomes another tool of pressure. The next accused chooses life. A voice cracks, then spills names. The room exhales like a beast satisfied. You see the judges write fast. You hear ink scratch paper like rats in walls. You feel the crowd's mood change instantly, from rage to relief, because the machine receives fuel. But each name spoken creates another target. Therefore, confession becomes contagion. You leave the court and the village looks the same, but it does not feel the same. Every path seems watched. Every greeting sounds rehearsed. You don't know if the next name will be yours, your spouse's, your child's. You try to remember every careless word spoken in anger, every envy, every petty slight. But memory becomes a weapon pointed inward. Therefore, the town begins to devour itself. Night brings no rest. You lie down and hear distant crying through thin walls. You imagine the jail, packed, airless. You imagine the gallows being built, wood cut with practical hands. You feel your own body tense at every sound, because a knock on the door now means a paper with your name. But sleep still comes in fragments. Therefore, nightmares blend with daylight. You wake to rumors of executions. You run toward the meeting house because feet always run toward spectacle. You see a cart, a rope, a cluster of people moving as one organism. You smell sweat and wet wool. You hear prayers spoken loud, as if volume proves righteousness. But righteousness looks different from every angle. Therefore, no one agrees on what they are watching. At the hanging ground, you see the condemned stand on rough boards. A minister urges confession like a man trying to save a drowning swimmer by pushing their head under until they promise to breathe differently. The condemned refuses. The rope waits. You feel bile rise in your throat because the refusal is brave, but bravery does not stop the law. Therefore, bravery turns into a lesson for everyone watching: resist and die. The drop comes. The body jerks. The crowd makes a sound that is half gasp, half prayer. You feel your knees weaken for a moment. But the crowd steadies itself by repeating the story. This is necessary. This is cleansing. This is God's work. Therefore, the horror becomes holy by repetition. You stumble away, but the village does not allow privacy. A neighbor grabs your sleeve and whispers, "Did you see how the rope acts? Did you hear her words?" Every detail becomes evidence, because evidence is a hunger that never fills. But if everything is evidence, nothing is safe. Therefore, the only protection becomes alignment with the crowd. You carry more papers. The ink blurs in damp air. You knock on another door. This time it belongs to someone known for property, fields, a good house, livestock. The door opens and the man inside stares at the paper as if it is a death sentence. His wife clutches a key ring because keys mean control, and control is vanishing. But even property cannot buy silence now. Therefore, property becomes part of the stake. Fees multiply like weeds. You hear of families forced to pay for shackles, for straw, for food, for the very chains that bruise wrists. You see a man sell his land cheap to raise coin because the jailer does not wait. But cheap sales create winners. Therefore, someone quietly benefits. You begin to notice patterns that hide behind prayers. A farm changes hands after an accusation. A boundary dispute ends when one party sits in jail. A loud critic of village leadership suddenly becomes suspect. But these patterns are never spoken aloud because speaking aloud invites attention. Therefore, suspicion remains pointed outward, away from the machinery. Inside the court again, the afflicted girls perform certainty. You see them fall, rise, point, fall again. The room follows their bodies like a flock follows a bell. You feel disgust rise, but disgust is dangerous because it looks like doubt. But doubt is treated like alliance with the devil. Therefore, you keep your face still. A moment snaps. One girl points toward the benches, toward the watchers, not the accused. The room stiffens. A murmur rolls like thunder. You feel your blood turn to ice because the accusation now leaps the barrier. It does not stay on the poor and strange, but the magistrate's eyes flash with opportunity. Therefore, the net widens. You see a respected church member dragged forward to answer. The person stammers, shocked, offended. The offended tone backfires. The afflicted scream harder. The court interprets indignation as arrogance. But arrogance is easy to label as sinful. Therefore, the respected become vulnerable. The village spins faster. You walk past houses where curtains twitch. You hear children practicing the language of accusation in play because children copy power. You smell stew that tastes thin because labor vanishes into jail and court. But hunger does not stop the trials. Therefore, hunger becomes another reason to find a scapegoat. A confession scene becomes theater. The accused sobs and nods and agrees to whatever the court suggests. Yes, yes, it is true. You see judges relax. You see spectators look satisfied because the story now has a neat shape. But the neat shape is false comfort. Therefore, the lie becomes a pillar holding up a collapsing world. Fog of war thickens. You do not know which testimony matters, which is invented, which is coerced, which is sincere. You do not know if the afflicted believe their own cries. You do not know if the judges suspect error. But you see that the machine moves even when nobody feels in control. Therefore, fear becomes the driver, not reason. Then the machine hits a hard object, doubt from within the powerful. A whisper spreads that a governor's wife faces suspicion. Suddenly, certainty wobbles. You feel the room hesitate for the first time. But hesitation is dangerous because it admits the possibility of mistake. Therefore, officials begin to search for a way to stop without admitting guilt. The accusations slow. The court's appetite weakens. The executions end, not with triumph, but with awkward silence. You see judges avoid certain eyes in the street. You hear a new careful voice of regret, petitions, apologies, misled, mistaken, carried away. But regret does not resurrect the dead. Therefore, regret sounds thin. You walk past farms neglected, fences sagging, fields choked with weeds. You see debts swollen like infected wounds. You see families shattered, widows bargaining for survival, children staring at empty chairs. You smell smoke from hearths that burn too little wood because wood costs coin, and coin vanishes into fees. But the village still must eat. Therefore, the living pay for the dead. Property sits at the center like a quiet corpse nobody admits is there. You hear of land seized. You hear of goods inventoried and redistributed. You hear of legal costs that never stop. Some property changes hands. Some grudges get paid in full without ever being named. But the town prefers a safer story. Therefore, the tale becomes hysteria, a storm of madness that absolves structure. You stand over the docket like a detective over a body. The wounds are legal, not supernatural. Papers cause chains. Fees cause sales. Testimony causes death. But behind every paper stands a human need, fear of raids, fear of hunger, fear of disgrace. Therefore, the system feeds on fear because fear is plentiful. The modern mirror opens like a door in the mind. You walk back into your own century carrying the taste of that courtroom dust. You see screens glow instead of candles. You hear outrage travel faster than a horse. You feel how quickly a crowd forms around a claim that cannot be weighed, cannot be touched, yet demands punishment. But the mechanism stays familiar. Therefore, the warning stays sharp. When fear becomes evidence, accusation becomes currency. You see it in workplaces where rumor replaces proof. You see it in politics where enemies become monsters so negotiation becomes treason. You see it online where a single clip becomes a rope and the crowd pulls hard because pulling feels like justice. But wherever accusation becomes currency, someone profits, socially, politically, financially, while the crowd believes it only chases monsters. Therefore, the Salem pattern never dies, it only changes costume. Now the verdict lands not as a gavel, but as weight in the chest. You count the cost in faces, the neighbor who refuses to confess and pays with breath, the one who confesses and pays with conscience, the child who learns that pointing keeps you safe, the widow who trades a cow for a husband's stale bread in jail. The village survives, but it survives scarred. But survival is not the same as innocence. Therefore, the real haunting is not spirits, it is the memory of how quickly decent people cooperate with a machine once it promises safety. The mirror sharpens again. Do you see the same bargain offered today? Trade doubt for belonging, trade caution for applause, trade patience for the sweet rush of certainty? You feel how tempting it is, because certainty is warm in a cold world. But certainty can also be a weapon that chooses targets before it chooses truth. Therefore, the question is not, could Salem happen again? The question is, what version of Salem already lives nearby, waiting for a scream? The legacy question waits at the crossroads, ungoogleable and heavy. Imagine a knock hits your door tonight, not from a magistrate, but from a crowd, neighbors, co-workers, strangers, demanding agreement, demanding a name. You feel your hand hover over the latch. You see the safe path, point outward, join the chorus, stay clean. But you also see the harder path, demand proof, accept isolation, risk becoming the next suspect. Therefore, when the moment arrives and fear offers safety at the price of someone else's life, what does your hand do on the latch?